Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Experience Points. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and on each episode, I sit down with some really cool people within the RPG and gaming communities. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Michale Sands, who is a tabletop RPG creator who has worked on a bunch of really cool games, including Monster of the Week. Without any further ado, let's meet our guest and get into the interview.
I'm Michale Sands. I'm the author of Monster of the Week and a few other games that are not quite as successful. Yeah, that's pretty much my claim to fame in the gaming world.
So what sort of projects have you been working on recently after Monster of the Week?
Well, recently it's mainly been all the extra work for the Codex of Worlds Kickstarter, crowdfund for Monster of the Week. But I've also got a few other projects on the go, which I'm looking forward to getting back to once we've finished all that stretch goal material. One of those is a game called Glorious, which is about Age of Sail naval adventures, so Aubrey and Maturin or Hornblower, all that sort of thing. And the other one is currently got the working title Xenogate Expedition 13, which is a kind of Stargate adjacent sort of science fiction game. Yeah, so those are the other things I'm working on right now.
So how did you first get into playing RPGs?
When I was about 11, my neighbours got a copy of the basic D&D box set and invited me to join in. So I've been playing ever since then.
Is there a specific RPG game that you really love and that you play very often?
No, not really. I'm actually a big fan of getting as much variety as possible into the gaming I do. So I like to try out new things and see what's neat. Probably my favourite recently would be the Alien RPG from Free League. I've had a lot of fun playing that in a variety of groups over the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm. When looking for a new RPG to play, what do you look for in the game that sort of draws you to it?
Like a new and interesting setting and theme. Like, I'm interested in games that are trying to do something different, particularly if it's something I haven't seen before at all.
What initially drew you to creating RPGs?
Well, I think I started tinkering and homebrewing stuff quite early on. So I think it's kind of always been there as part of the hobby for me, is, you know, not just playing a game that you buy from the store, but making up your own house rules, your own adventures, you know, and ultimately that kind of evolved into whole games. Particularly, like in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was quite a blossoming of kind of role-playing game design happening online through forums like The Forge and other places like that. And I kind of got sucked into some of those discussions and things that encouraged me a lot.
So how did you first come up with the concept of your first published RPG, Monster of the Week?
That is purely down to starting to watch Supernatural and thinking, I really want a role-playing game that does that.
So after thinking of the initial idea and wanting to create that game, how did you then go about actually making the game exist?
I put together some initial ideas and started kind of running that with my regular group and at local conventions. This was a few years before the final version was published, and it was definitely way before it became a Powered by the Apocalypse game. That was before Apocalypse World was released as well. And basically it all got transformed when Apocalypse World did come out. I played that and I thought, this game is doing a lot of the things that I want Monster of the Week to do. So I kind of turned it into a version of that Apocalypse World style game with only a few remaining bits from the previous system left.
So what is the process for actually going and making the RPG, and what are some things that you have to do as a creator of RPGs that most people playing it don't really think about while they're playing it?
I think probably the biggest thing people don't appreciate is how much polishing, editing, and organizing there is to take something from kind of a set of rules that you can play and turn it into the product that you buy. In a lot of ways, the designing and writing that initial draft is relatively straightforward, but turning that into something that people can get, that's hard.
Do you often sort of play games that you've created, or do you tend to like to try new stuff and not look at the same stuff you've been working on for hours and hours?
While I'm working on it, I'll play it as much as I can because I think that playing the games you're designing, seeing what works and what doesn't, is critically important for actually getting it finished. But once it's done, I'll be I like to play it for a while, but the reaches a point where I've spent so much time in that world that I don't really want to go back. Monster of the Week's a good example of that. Like these days, I only really play that if I'm like demoing it for people or testing out something new. It would be unusual for me to jump into a Monster of the Week game just for the fun of it because I have played so much of it over the years, as you can imagine.
When playtesting stuff like Monster of the Week that you've worked on, do you tend to play as the game master or do you tend to play as like a member of the party?
Usually when you're designing and playtesting, you'll end up in the game master type role because that's kind of, you're organizing it, you want to see what happens. But also as a designer, it is very important to play from the other side as well. So yeah, for any game designers out there, don't just host and run the game yourself. Make sure you find someone who'll do that for you so you can see it from the player's side as well. And you also want to get it to people who don't have you there to help them with rules questions too, just to confirm that your rules do actually tell people how to play without you being there to kind of guide it all along.
When you sit down to play different tabletop RPGs with your friends, do you tend to prefer to play as the game master or do you like being a member of the party?
I don't care. I regard either side as the. I don't really think of game mastering and being a player as separate in the way that a lot of people seem to. Like they're just different jobs you've got during the game. So yeah, I don't have a preference one way or the other. Although by habit, I'm the main game master of my regular group, but that's more just how things happened rather than an intentional preference.
So you being someone who writes these pieces for RPGs as your job, how does your prep process differ from when you're working on something professionally to when you're just putting together something for your friends in like a regular campaign setting?
Well, there's kind of a different goal in those because if I'm like writing an adventure to run with my usual group, I can get away with a bunch of notes in a notebook. When you're writing something professionally, you've got to not only cover what do I need to run this, which is often smaller because you had the idea in the first place, to I need to provide support for anyone who picks this up, who's interested, to figure out how everything goes, how everything fits together, which means like when I'm writing a mystery for sale for Monster of the Week, I'm going to put in a lot of details I wouldn't bother with if I was just going to run it myself. I'll write up more bystanders for them to meet, more places for them to visit, think about all the different ways that things could be approached, and like put a note about what would happen if they do this or that. So yeah, it's kind of almost a completely different thing, just because what's needed for a piece of work for someone to pick up and use is different to what I need to remind myself of my own plans, if that makes sense.
When creating pieces of your professional RPGs, where do you look for inspiration?
I don't specifically look for inspiration. I mean, I do read a lot and, watch a lot of films and TV. So I think inspiration just kind of washes over me. The thing that probably tends to prompt a game design is when I have an idea of a sort of game I want to play and I can't think of anything that does that already. Like I say, that's how Monster of the Week came to be. That's how my Age of Sail naval adventure game came to be. And that's usually the source. It's, I've kind of got a hankering to play this sort of game, and I don't know of one that's out there already.
So when you went to publish Monster of the Week, what did that process look like, and what were some things you learned through going through the publishing process that you now take with you when making new projects?
Well, the very first publishing was I crowdfunded myself and did a print-on-demand version. That was a huge learning experience because that was back in the end of 2011. So crowdfunding was a bit newer back then. There wasn't kind of as many resources. So I had to kind of figure out a lot of that on my own. And the same with learning how to deal with print on demand and lay out a book for all that. So there's a lot of that kind of technical stuff that I was forced to pick up. Since then, and later on with my partnership with Evil Hat Games for Evil Hat Productions for Monster of the Week, kind of a lot of that technical stuff is no longer something I have to worry about because the Evil Hat team very good at that, and they do almost all of that work, which means that I've these days working with them, I'm concentrating much more on the text quality, editing, and making sure that the raw material I provide is as good as possible. And in terms of what other people can take away, I think, like, however you do it, like, you're going to learn a lot. And that can vary from, like, if you put together a little PDF to publish on somewhere like itch.io or DriveThruRPG, like, you're going to learn a lot about the software you use to make it. You're going to learn a little bit about how things fit together. You know, every part of it's going to be new stuff you pick up.
How do you feel that storytelling through RPG is done best?
I'm not sure about best, but I really enjoy the unexpected moments that come out of the group at the table where, you know, people try things and no one really knew what was going to happen. And between the conversation with the other players or the way the rules are structured, you get something really cool that no one would have come up with on their own. Those moments are the ones that I get the most out of, I think. Particularly when they come together in a really satisfying way, but sometimes also when they come together in a way that leaves you going, how could that happen? That doesn't make any sense.
As a creator of RPG games, how do you work with your rules to try and make sure those sort of moments are able to happen?
I think that's where playtesting is essential. You need to frequently try things out so that you can observe what works and what doesn't. My process is pretty much, if I've got an idea for a game, write the minimum possible rules I can do to try it. Try that, see what worked, and then kind of revise and elaborate and add to it or take away from it as needed. And that can be quite a long process. I mean, Monster of the Week, I think, was in development for 6 or 7 years before publication. Maybe 4 or 5 years, but still years. So, you know, a lot of the time it's really trial and error of seeing what works and what doesn't, thinking when that happened in play, is that how I want these things to work? Yeah, so very much by feel, I guess.
How do you think that storytelling through RPGs is going to change and evolve in the coming years?
Well, there's the capacity and availability of online tools is probably the biggest thing I'd say that's really changed an immense amount in the past few years, and I assume that will continue happening. I still find most of the online role-playing tools and virtual tabletops quite annoying. Like, I don't really like them, but they're definitely getting better, and the fact that there is that opportunity to play games with people who are, you know, anywhere in the world is pretty great. Yeah. Aside from predictions beyond that, I think we're going to see there's already an immense amount of variety in what's available out there, but I think with all the recent ructions from Wizards of the Coast about D&D, I think we're going to see a bit of a burst of people moving away from D&D to doing their own thing, which will probably add a bit more diversity to the hobby, which is always good, I think.
What do you feel is the biggest lesson that you learned from working on Monster of the Week that you now carry with you while working on newer games?
That's a tough one. I think probably if I were to write it now, what would be different would be predominantly leaving less open spaces in the design. Because I intentionally, when I wrote it, left ambiguities and unaddressed things for people to figure out on their own. But like over the years, those places are always ones where people fall down, and ask questions online, like, what do I do about this thing? It doesn't say anything about that. So whether that would be framing it more like there are, like, having the game tell you there are places where I don't tell you what to do. You can figure that out on your own, or else filling in some of those gaps. It's perhaps the partly because I was originally writing it for what I wanted, me personally, and the fact that it's become quite successful and hit a much wider audience than I really ever expected at the beginning. Maybe that has kind of moved beyond the audience who are prepared to kind of take the rough edges and figure them out themselves, and into people who really want all those pieces already there, figured out for them.
What do you think the future of the genre of RPGs is, and how do you think this genre is going to change and evolve in the next 5 to 10 years?
I really don't know. I feel like I personally have a bit of a desire to return back to the most analog pen and paper roots of it at the moment. And I feel like there's probably a bit of a general move that way. But actually, in terms of, where the innovation will come, maybe there'll be some really cool stuff that begins to happen in virtual tabletops that kind of brings out new ideas. I did see, is it One More Multiverse, the recent one that has got a Blades in the Dark and your Zebra's Bread and Breakfast settings built into it, and it's kind of like an all-encompassing, like, 16-bit style world where you can walk your characters around and do things with them, as well as having all the game support. Like, that seems like that might be a really cool thing once it really gets going. But I think it's only a few games in there so far. So yeah, maybe something like that will happen. That'd be really cool.
You talked about this a little bit earlier, but what are your thoughts on the uses of technology such as VR and AR with running RPGs and also storytelling through RPGs?
It's not an area I have much of an interest in. I know there are people who do a lot in that area. Like, I know someone in my town who he actually custom made a huge fancy table so that every player in his D&D game could have their laptop plugged into it, and had all these kind of arrangements so that different people would see different versions of their maps and things like that, which everyone seemed to think was pretty cool. So I think that there's definitely a place for doing some quite neat stuff with kind of computer extra stuff at the game table. I guess you could do some work with soundtracks and lighting and things if you got really fancy. But yeah, like I say, I'm kind of at the, I'd rather get back to bare bones, rolling dice physically and writing things down on paper.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great sitting down and talking with you.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And that was the interview. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe so that you can see more content like this. Also, consider leaving us a like. Experience Points is sponsored by Foundry 6. Foundry 6 is a really cool company who is working on a really cool game called A Realm. A Realm is a video game that combines RPGs and AR technology. In the game, you will be able to fight dragons in your kitchen, deal with goblins in the streets, all sorts of really cool stuff. The game is currently in early access, so if you want to check it out, head on over to arealmrpg.com. That's AREALMRPG.com. Thank you so much for watching today's episode, and I hope I can see you next time.